What if Abraham Lincoln had not been assassinated? April 14th, 1865, the night that could have changed the course of American history. And yet, in this world, it doesn't. Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. is electric with laughter and applause. On stage, our American cousin entertains a weary nation just beginning to heal. President Abraham Lincoln sits in the presidential box, his tall frame wrapped in a black frock coat, a weary smile resting beneath eyes weathered by war. Next to him, Mary Todd Lincoln clutches his arm. They are not merely watching a play, they are witnessing the return of peace. But in the shadowed corridors behind them, John Wilkes Booth crouches, pistol in hand, rage in his heart. He is moments away from changing history. Except this time, he fails. Booth slips into the presidential box just as the audience erupts with laughter at one of the play's funniest lines. He raises the derringer to fire, but Lincoln, ever alert despite his exhaustion, shifts in his seat at the sound of the door creaking open. The movement throws off Booth's aim. The shot cracks through the box, striking Lincoln in the shoulder rather than the head. Mary Todd screams. Guards rush in as Booth attempts to flee. He jumps, fractures his leg as he did in our history, but he is tackled before he can escape. For a moment, chaos reigns. But Abraham Lincoln is alive. The bullet lodged near his clavicle, missing vital organs. Doctors act quickly. Within days, he is declared out of danger, though he'll carry the scar and the pain for the rest of his life. Booth, on the other hand, is imprisoned. Unlike the martyrdom that would have enshrined him in Southern memory, he becomes a footnote, a failed assassin, publicly tried and executed, his cause disgraced rather than glorified. In the days that follow, as word of Lincoln's survival spreads, jubilation sweeps through the North, and anxiety grips the South. For many Confederates, Lincoln's death had seemed a strange hope, an opening for leniency or chaos. His survival shatters that illusion. To them, the man who broke the Confederacy now returns, not as a martyred symbol, but as a flesh-and-blood leader ready to impose his vision. And that vision was never soft. Despite his kindness, Lincoln had no illusions about the post-war South. In this alternate timeline, his plan for Reconstruction moves forward, but now it carries a sharper edge. No longer haunted by the mythos that would have risen from his grave, Lincoln becomes a living force pressing forward a delicate balance to reconcile a shattered nation without surrendering to the reactionary forces still bubbling beneath its surface. Vice President Andrew Johnson never ascends. His lenient sympathies are known, but they remain irrelevant. Instead, he watches from the sidelines, marginalized by a president newly reinvigorated by both survival and a deeper sense of divine purpose. Lincoln interprets his near-death experience not as random fortune, but as providence. "I was spared for a reason," he tells his cabinet, his voice low but firm. And that reason is to finish what we started. Thus begins Lincoln's second act, a chapter history never wrote, but this world will come to know. Behind closed doors, he moves swiftly. He retains the radical Republicans in his cabinet, men like Edwin Stanton and Charles Sumner, but makes it clear he will not let Reconstruction be driven by revenge alone. His goal, to remake the Union not just in name, but in spirit. Military governors remain in the South, but with Lincoln's direction, they enforce the new Reconstruction Acts with greater clarity and moral purpose. Freedmen's rights are elevated beyond paperwork. Lincoln personally backs the expansion of the Freedmen's Bureau, more funding, more agents, and critically, the enlistment of Black veterans to protect former slaves from vengeful militias and old slaveholding elites. This new strategy faces fierce resistance. In Mississippi and Alabama, secret councils of former Confederates form, early incarnations of what might have become the Ku Klux Klan. But Lincoln sees it coming. Learning from the war, he dispatches Union troops into hot zones with clear orders. Protect the ballot, protect the school, i.e., protect the freedman. "These men fought for us," he tells Congress. "Now we must fight for them." The clash between federal power and Southern defiance escalates, not unlike in our world. But now, with Lincoln's voice guiding the nation, not drowned in marble statues and funeral hymns, his words carry weight. His authority is unchallenged, even by rivals in the Republican Party. And yet, for all his might, Lincoln is not invincible. In the halls of Washington, powerful men conspire. Conservative Republicans and Northern Democrats, frustrated by Lincoln's continued commitment to black equality and federal authority, begin to whisper of overreach. Some call him a dictator in disguise. Others resent the way he bypasses traditional power structures to ensure Reconstruction continues uninterrupted. The election of 1868 looms. Lincoln, now visibly older and marked by the pain in his wounded shoulder, prepares for what may be the final campaign of his life. Rumors swirl. Will he seek a third term? Will Grant challenge him? Will the Democratic Party, still bitter and broken, find a way to revive itself through appeals to white fear and lost causes? For the moment, Lincoln keeps silent. Instead, he travels. He visits the South, something he never did in our timeline. In Richmond, he walks the ruined streets, shaking hands with freedmen and former rebels alike. In Charleston, he delivers a speech beneath the shadow of Fort Sumter, proclaiming, "We began this war to preserve the Union. We end it to perfect the Union." The crowd is divided, but captivated. Meanwhile, abroad, Europe watches closely. In Britain and France, Lincoln's survival stirs renewed interest in the American experiment. Would the United States emerge stronger from the ashes of war or fracture anew? Monarchs and ministers consider the implications for colonies, for commerce, for the future of democracy. And yet, in all this movement, the question remains, can Lincoln truly bind the wounds of war without tearing open new ones? In small towns across the South, Union troops enforce federal law while whispers of rebellion simmer. In the North, workers grow restless as industrialization marches on without them. The nation is no longer at war, but it is not at peace. And that was only the beginning of the storm. By the summer of 1866, the war was over, but the scars of slavery and secession still burned fresh across the American landscape. Cotton fields lay in ruin, courthouses stood half empty, and along the dusty roads of Mississippi and Georgia, newly freed men and women walked with heads held high and eyes ever watchful. Freedom, they had been told, was theirs, but danger still lurked behind every doorframe. In this alternate timeline, Abraham Lincoln did not become a martyr. He became a force, a tireless, often unpredictable executive determined not to let peace become surrender. At night, the president often walked the dim corridors of the executive mansion, candle in hand, rereading the words of the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. He had signed the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. Now, 3 years later, he was determined to make those words binding law. His first great mission, after surviving the assassination attempt, was constitutional. In July 1866, Lincoln threw the full weight of the presidency behind the 14th Amendment, an amendment granting citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the United States, including former slaves. Unlike in our timeline, Lincoln's living presence unified the Republican Party, for now. While radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens pushed for harsher punishments against the South, and moderates urged reconciliation, Lincoln walked a third path, Reconstruction without retribution, but with unshakable resolve. In a speech before Congress, broadcast by the earliest wire services across the nation, Lincoln declared, "This is not a time to rest. We do not bind up the nation's wounds by pretending they were never inflicted. We must honor the sacrifice of those who bled by defending the liberties for which they died, and that means liberty for all, not in theory, but in truth." The 14th Amendment passed. Barely, but with Lincoln at the helm, its ratification among the southern states became a new kind of battlefield. Resistance emerged immediately. In Alabama, former Confederate officers, now barred from holding public office, convened secret meetings. Across Tennessee and Georgia, a new phenomenon took shape. White supremacist militias, men masked in sheets, riding by night, burning schools, lynching black leaders, intimidating anyone who dared to vote Republican or teach freedmen to read. The Klan had arrived. I earlier and more aggressively than in our world. But this time, so had Lincoln. When the first reports reached Washington of massacres in Pulaski County and the destruction of Freedmen's Bureau offices in rural Louisiana, Lincoln's reaction was swift and unflinching. He summoned General Ulysses S. Grant to the White House and delivered a simple order. If they do not respect the law, we will bring the law to their doorstep. Grant mobilized federal troops to southern districts, backed by martial law under the Enforcement Acts. Lincoln went further than any president before him. He authorized military tribunals for those found guilty of terrorizing freedmen or obstructing federal officers. He called these groups what they were: insurgents, enemies of the Union who wear no uniform but spread rebellion just the same. It was not without cost. White backlash surged. Northern Democrats railed against what they called Lincoln's tyranny. Newspapers across the Midwest accused the administration of invading its own citizens. In New York, riots broke out as Irish immigrants, struggling for jobs and manipulated by racial demagogues, blamed freed slaves for their economic hardship. In private, Lincoln confided in Frederick Douglass, now a regular guest at the Executive Mansion. "I fear I am asking too much of this country," Lincoln said, his voice hoarse. "No," Douglass replied. "You are asking exactly what it has long owed, and so the Union held. But barely. Economically, the South was desperate. Plantations collapsed, banks had failed, railroads were torn apart. But Lincoln saw this devastation not as a tragedy to be lamented, but as a chance to rebuild from new foundations. In one of his most radical moves, Lincoln supported the Southern Homestead Act, legislation designed to redistribute abandoned Confederate lands to freedmen and poor whites. Hundreds of thousands of acres, previously held by absentee planters and traitorous elites, were seized and parceled out. In Georgia, entire counties were transformed. Black families built their own communities, self-sufficient, determined, proud. Schools blossomed under the Freedmen's Bureau, black churches doubled as community centers and political halls. But land reform came at a cost. Northern capitalists and Southern planters alike bristled at what they called government theft. Former Confederate officers who had been quietly biding their time now joined hands with railroad tycoons and bankers to undermine Lincoln's policies. An informal but powerful coalition of opposition formed, one that would outlast his presidency, and perhaps even the century. Meanwhile, on the international stage, the world watched with wary fascination. In London, Prime Minister Lord Russell declared that Lincoln's survival had prevented an American Caesar. But in private, British diplomats wondered whether a strong United States, under Lincoln's moral leadership, might begin to export not just cotton and wheat, but ideology. In Paris, Emperor Napoleon III withdrew the last of his troops from Mexico earlier than in our timeline. With Lincoln alive and American troops still occupying the South, France feared the revived U.S. would enforce the Monroe Doctrine with new vigor. Back home, Lincoln continued to travel, despite threats to his life. In late 1866, he rode to New Orleans to inspect the Reconstruction efforts and deliver one of the most famous speeches never given in our timeline. Beneath the burned husks of plantation manors, Lincoln stood before a mixed crowd: black veterans in uniform, poor white farmers, Union officers, and uneasy Southern civilians. "We are building a republic anew," he said, "not with chains, not with whips, but with ballots and books, and the blood shed to preserve this union shall not be in vain. The rising generation, white and black, shall inherit more than the ashes of war. They shall inherit a promise fulfilled." It was a turning point. The speech was reprinted in every major paper north of the Mason-Dixon line. His approval surged among freedmen and abolitionists, even as it cratered among white Southern landowners and Northern industrialists alike. A paradox began to emerge. Lincoln was becoming both more beloved and more hated, more powerful and more endangered than ever before. And through it all, one question lingered in every corridor of power from Washington to Atlanta. How long could one man hold together a union still at war with itself? He would find out soon enough. Because on the horizon, a new storm was gathering, not of rebellion this time, but of ambition. For even as Lincoln tried to pass the torch to the next generation, someone else was preparing to take it, with or without his blessing. And what came after was even more unexpected. By early 1867, the United States teetered between rebirth and relapse. Reconstruction had become more than policy. It had become a battlefield of ideals. Freedmen walked with cautious pride. Ballot boxes had replaced bayonets, and the old Confederacy was being rewritten not just on maps, but in the minds of a divided people. But even as President Abraham Lincoln fought for a moral restoration of the Union, another figure emerged from the fog of war, a man whose loyalty was unquestioned, but whose ambitions were, perhaps, unknowable. General Ulysses S. Grant, hero of the Union victory, the architect of Lee's surrender at Appomattox, and the most admired military man in the country. He was stoic, incorruptible, and immensely popular. Among the people, especially Northern veterans, Grant was more than a general. He was a savior, and he was being watched. Within the Republican Party, fissures had begun to form. Radical Republicans, though grateful for Lincoln's commitment to civil rights, whispered about his leniency. Moderates, increasingly concerned about political stability, urged caution. Business elites, frustrated by Lincoln's meddling in land redistribution and his tolerance for labor agitation in northern factories, sought a return to normalcy. In this fragmented landscape, Grant's name carried weight and danger. In New York, a coalition of Republican financiers and party strategists quietly approached the general. They urged him to consider a presidential run in 1868. The pitch was simple. Lincoln had done his duty. Now it was time for a unifier, a figure with universal respect, a man above politics. At first, Grant resisted. He remained loyal to Lincoln, who had trusted him throughout the war and now continued to rely on him to enforce Reconstruction in the South. But even Grant could feel the strain. He saw firsthand the violence erupting in Mississippi, the midnight raids by Klansmen in North Carolina, the Southern juries refusing to convict white men for murdering freedmen. He understood what Lincoln was trying to do, and he also saw its limits. One evening in March, Grant visited the White House alone. The two men sat in silence for several minutes before Lincoln spoke. "I hear the talk," Lincoln said. "About you, about 1868. Grant didn't flinch. "It's not coming from me." "I know," Lincoln said, folding his hands. "But it's coming, and I won't run again." The room seemed to darken. Lincoln's face was drawn, thinner than even the warriors had left it. His shoulder still ached from Booth's bullet, but it was more than that. He had become a symbol of a war-weary republic, respected, even revered, but also tired, even fragile. "I'll serve until March 1869, Lincoln said quietly. "Then I'm going home." Grant stared at him. "You think they'll keep this together without you?" Lincoln shook his head slowly. "I don't know. But it's not for me to hold together forever. That's the trap of tyrants." Grant left the meeting conflicted. For the first time, the path ahead seemed clear and terrifying. Elsewhere, the country continued to fracture. In South Carolina, a black militia formed under the leadership of Sergeant Elijah Cross, a former Union soldier who had returned to protect his hometown of Orangeburg. After a series of brutal attacks by white supremacist groups, Cross organized patrols, established safe houses, and even launched his own newspaper, The New Republic. His voice became emblematic of a new generation, free, proud, and unwilling to retreat. But the backlash was fierce. The Red String Societies, secret networks of Confederate loyalists, began a campaign of targeted assassinations against black leaders school teachers, and federal agents. In 1 month alone, over a dozen were killed across Georgia and Alabama. The violence forced Lincoln's hand. He signed a sweeping executive order expanding federal authority to arrest and prosecute domestic terrorists under military jurisdiction. Civil libertarians balked. Southern governors threatened open rebellion. But Lincoln pressed forward. Reconstruction, he told Congress, is not a negotiation with treason. It is the enforcement of justice. Still, the attacks escalated. By mid-1867, Congress created a joint committee on domestic insurgency. Lincoln gave the committee full access to military reports, a move that stunned critics but strengthened his hand. The nation now had numbers, names, and evidence, and it had a face: Grant. The general returned to Washington to testify. In a closed session, he described the systematic sabotage of Reconstruction efforts, the complicity of local authorities, and the daily threats faced by Union troops in the South. His calm, deliberate testimony carried the weight of war. By the time he stepped down, one thing was certain: the public saw in Grant not just a witness to Reconstruction, but its guardian. The 1868 election loomed larger by the day. The Democratic Party, though weakened, had found new energy in former Union officers who opposed Reconstruction and Northern businessmen fearful of federal overreach. Their frontrunner, George B. McClellan, Lincoln's old rival. A former general, McClellan ran on a platform of peace with honor, pledging to withdraw federal troops, end military tribunals, and restore local control in the South. Lincoln saw the danger clearly. He couldn't run again, but he could campaign. In the summer of 1868, he toured the North one final time. Not as a candidate, but as a prophet of unfinished revolution. He stood in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Cleveland, declaring that the peace we seek must be peace for all, not just for the powerful. His speeches rekindled the spirit of 1863, not the battlefield courage, but the moral thunder of emancipation. And when Lincoln finally endorsed a candidate, he did so with careful but unmistakable clarity. "I do not endorse men," he said in a speech in Springfield. "I endorse the cause they carry, and should General Grant decide to take up that cause, I can think of no steadier hand to place on the wheel." Grant's candidacy was sealed. The Republican National Convention in Chicago was electric. Grant's nomination was unanimous. His running mate, Senator Charles Sumner, a radical abolitionist and fierce defender of civil rights, the ticket was powerful, symbolic, and controversial. But it carried with it Lincoln's legacy and the wrath of those who had always opposed it. In the final months before the election, violence surged. In North Carolina, black voters were driven from the polls. In Indiana, Democratic operatives were caught paying for fraudulent ballots. Lincoln's final executive act before the election was the establishment of a federal electoral protection agency, a forerunner to what, in later years, would become the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. The election of 1868 was the most contested in American history to date. But Grant and Sumner won, narrowly. A coalition of Northern veterans, black freedmen, abolitionists, and moderate Republicans carried the day. McClellan conceded, but his supporters did not. And so, the torch passed. Lincoln, gaunt but steady, stood beside Grant on Inauguration Day in March 1869, his eyes sweeping the crowd. The Capitol dome stood completed, but behind it loomed the unfinished scaffolding of a still divided nation. As the band played and the crowd cheered, Lincoln leaned toward Grant and said quietly, "Now you must finish what we began." But even as Lincoln prepared to leave Washington behind, fate had not finished with him yet, because the struggle for the soul of the Republic was only entering its next chapter, one in which old enemies would find new allies, and the battle would no longer be confined to the borders of the United States, and that was only the beginning of the global reckoning. When Abraham Lincoln boarded the train departing Washington in the spring of 1869, the Capitol sighed with relief and uncertainty. He was leaving office not in disgrace, but in fatigue. The war, the bullet, and the burden of rebuilding a nation had drained him. Yet the man who had steered America through its greatest trial did not retire into silence. He was, after all, still Abraham Lincoln. From his home in Springfield, Illinois, Lincoln continued to write letters, essays, private correspondences. His thoughts on Reconstruction, civil rights, and the future of the Union now traveled faster than his feet ever could. But while he stepped out of power, the world stepped into a new phase of turbulence, a phase shaped not just by Lincoln's legacy, but by America's growing gravitational pull on the global stage. By the time Grant took office, the United States was no longer just a recovering republic. It was a rising force, rearmed and economically revived. The war had devastated the South, but it had accelerated Northern industry. Railroads crisscrossed the continent, steel mills blazed in Pittsburgh, the population surged westward. And with freedmen entering the economy in southern towns and cities, America's labor force was more dynamic and more contested than ever. But power invites rivalry, and Lincoln's moral vision had not only unsettled the American elite, it had rattled monarchies abroad. In London, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli met privately with Queen Victoria to discuss what he called the American question. Britain had remained officially neutral during the Civil War, though many of its aristocrats had sympathized with the Confederacy. Now, with Lincoln's vision triumphing and Grant poised to enforce it, Disraeli feared a future in which America exported not only cotton but revolution. What worried Europe wasn't American arms, it was American ideals. Already, Lincoln's emancipation had stirred restlessness across colonial empires. In Jamaica, former slaves held in economic bondage began organizing strikes. In India, whispers of liberty filtered through Christian mission schools. In Ireland, nationalist groups cited Lincoln's victory over secession as inspiration for their own bid for independence. But the most immediate flashpoint was Mexico. In our timeline, France had withdrawn its puppet emperor, Maximilian, in 1867. But in this alternate world, where Lincoln survived and U.S. resolve remained strong, the French exit came earlier, under clear American pressure. With France retreating, Mexico's Republican forces, led by Benito Juarez, re-established control. And Lincoln, in one of his final diplomatic gestures before leaving office, recognized Juarez's government and sent material aid. This solidified an unprecedented alliance, a northern republic recovering from civil war, and a southern neighbor reclaiming sovereignty from monarchy. But not everyone in America approved. Southern Democrats, still bitter from defeat, saw Latin alliances as distractions from their demand for home rule. Northern industrialists, meanwhile, feared instability on their southern border might disrupt emerging markets. And in Texas, ex-Confederates began slipping across the border to foment rebellion and smuggle arms, not unlike the filibusters of decades past. President Grant responded with characteristic discipline. He sent federal marshals to the border, authorized military assistance to Mexico under the pretext of stability, and warned European powers that any intervention in the Americas would be met with resolute defense of hemispheric self-determination. It was the Monroe Doctrine, supercharged. By late 1869, American advisors and engineers had begun traveling to Mexico to assist with railroad construction and land reform, a mirror of what was happening in the southern U.S. The idea, crafted quietly by Lincoln and now pursued by Grant, was revolutionary. Two republics, scarred by civil war and foreign interference, rising together under the banner of democracy and racial equality. But the project had enemies on both sides of the border. In the United States, powerful political blocs opposed Lincoln's ongoing influence. Though he had stepped down, he had not stepped away. His essays, serialized in newspapers across the North and republished in abolitionist papers across the South, pushed for further land redistribution, national voting rights for Black citizens, and protections for labor unions. A storm was brewing. In the summer of 1870, Lincoln was invited to deliver the commencement address at Howard University, one of the first historically Black colleges, born of the Reconstruction spirit. What he said there would ripple far beyond Washington. Freedom without opportunity is a mirage. Justice without protection is a mockery. The work we began in war must be completed in peace, or it will all unravel. It was a challenge and a warning. That fall, across southern states, white resistance surged again. In Louisiana and Mississippi, armed mobs attacked polling places. Black families were burned out of their homes. Redemption became the rallying cry of a white counter-revolution determined to overturn Republican rule by force if necessary. And yet, there was a difference. In this world, the federal government didn't look away. President Grant invoked the Insurrection Act and deployed federal troops to protect black voters. In Alabama, a detachment of the 25th Infantry, mostly composed of black soldiers, fought off a violent mob attempting to seize a courthouse. In Georgia, federal marshals arrested over 300 suspected Klan members. Trials followed, not just in local courts, but in newly established federal civil rights tribunals. Still, resistance was like smoke, impossible to crush completely. Behind closed doors in Washington, Lincoln met with Grant in one of their last major consultations. The former president's face was lined, his shoulders stiff, but his voice remained strong. "If we stop now," Lincoln said, "they will rewrite it all. They will erase every name, every sacrifice. Reconstruction is not a gift we gave the South. It is a debt we owe the dead." But it was not just the South he worried about now. Back in Europe, the Prussians had gone to war with France. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 had erupted, and the Old World Order was shattering. As Paris burned and empires realigned, American diplomats, under Lincoln's quiet influence and Grant's formal leadership, began to position the United States not just as a regional power, but a global symbol. Not through conquest, but through conviction. American diplomats offered sanctuary to refugees. New treaties were signed with struggling European republics, and abolitionist papers in London quoted Lincoln's addresses like scripture. But the transformation came at a price. Inside the United States, growing federal power bred resentment. Western farmers, ignored in favor of Southern Reconstruction and Eastern finance, began organizing politically. Labor unions, emboldened by Lincoln's moral backing, demanded wage protections. And across the South, the old aristocracy bided its time, waiting for the federal grip to slip. By 1871, the United States was no longer the fractured nation of 1865, but it was still a fragile one. And as foreign embassies opened in Washington and black politicians entered Congress in record numbers, one question loomed over the entire American experiment. Could a republic born of revolution, reshaped by war and tested by justice, hold? Because the enemies of this new world were no longer wearing gray uniforms or marching under rebel flags. They were wearing suits, and they were coming for the future by rewriting the past. And in the shadows of this new political battlefield, a figure from Lincoln's past, long thought irrelevant, was preparing to strike. In the dim halls of the Willard Hotel, just blocks from the White House, voices murmured in cautious unison. The year was 1872, and as the United States strode forward under the iron hand of Grant and the lingering shadow of Lincoln, a quiet counter-movement was preparing to reclaim what they believed had been stolen, their country. It was not a Southern movement. Not at first. It began in the North, among men who had opposed the war, who had despised Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and who now viewed Reconstruction as a tyrannical reordering of society. They had been called Copperheads, Northern Democrats who sympathized with the South, and though they had been driven underground by war and Lincoln's survival, they had not disappeared. Now they were reborn. Led by figures like Clement Vallandigham, the exiled, defiant former congressman from Ohio, the Copperhead faction returned under a new banner, the American Constitutional League. It was a clever name for a dangerous cause. Their mission, to dismantle federal Reconstruction, restore state sovereignty, and purge the Republic of what they called moral imperialism. They cloaked themselves in legalism. They quoted the Constitution like scripture. But behind the language lay a deeper goal: to restore the racial and economic hierarchies that Lincoln had spent the last decade trying to upend. Vallandigham had been living in Canada after his wartime arrest and exile. But in this timeline, with Lincoln surviving and the radical Republicans dominating Washington, he found new purpose. He returned to Ohio in secret in late 1871 and began organizing. By early 1872, he emerged publicly, defiant, sharp-tongued, and magnetic. And he was not alone. Disgruntled factory owners in New Jersey, white urban workers in Chicago resentful of black labor competition, Irish immigrant communities manipulated by Democratic ward bosses, they all found a strange appeal in Vallandigham's words. "We fought to preserve the Union," he declared at a rally in Cincinnati, "not to dismantle our states, not to flood our cities with radical experiments, and not to turn over our heritage to the whims of utopians." His voice echoed from saloons to lecture halls. Pamphlets flooded the Midwest. In Southern newspapers, his speeches were reprinted verbatim, not as a Northern curiosity, but as a manifesto. The timing was perfect. President Grant, though popular among veterans and freedmen, had begun to show the limits of military-driven Reconstruction. Scandals bubbled within his administration: railroad bribery, patronage schemes, and accusations of misuse of Reconstruction funds. Though Grant remained personally uncorrupted, the system was bloating, and with it, public patience. And then came the economic tremors. In early 1873, the first signs of a financial panic gripped Wall Street. Railroad bonds collapsed, banks tightened credit. Workers were laid off by the thousands. Unrest spread from Pennsylvania coal towns to Chicago's steel mills. For many Americans, especially in the North, the idealism of Lincoln's republic began to give way to cold survival, and the Copperheads seized the moment. They did not speak in the fiery, theatrical tones of the Southern rebels. They wore suits. They claimed moderation. But their message was clear. The country had gone too far. Too many federal troops, too many taxes, too many promises to people who contribute nothing. Vallandigham's rhetoric turned sharp. "We are ruled by the ghost of a man who should have left with his presidency," he said, referring to Lincoln, who continued to publish essays and letters from Springfield, influencing policy and public sentiment despite no longer holding office. Lincoln's reaction to the Copperhead resurgence was somber. In a letter to Frederick Douglass, he wrote, "We may win the war and lose the peace, not by defeat, but by forgetting why we fought in the first place. The Constitution was not written to protect indifference. It was written to elevate conscience. But conscience was becoming a luxury. In the South, federal troops faced mounting resistance not just from Klansmen and armed mobs, but from local politicians who openly refused to enforce civil rights laws. Black schools were burned in Tennessee. Voter rolls were purged in Florida. White militias rebranded as Constitutional Guards began patrolling with impunity. President Grant pushed back. He expanded military enforcement. He demanded congressional funding for civil rights prosecutors. But his efforts were now seen, in both the South and North, as heavy-handed, even tyrannical. In 1874, midterm elections turned brutal. The Democrats, energized by Copperhead rhetoric and economic unrest, won a sweeping majority in the House. It was the first serious setback for Lincoln's legacy. Congressional investigations began, targeting freedmen's bureau administrators, federal marshals, and Northern abolitionist charities accused of misusing government funds. For the first time since the war, Lincoln's name became a point of contention, not unity. Cartoons in Democratic papers mocked him as King Abraham, the meddling old man who wouldn't retire. Editorials accused him of controlling Grant from the shadows, and one paper, the St. Louis Patriot, ran a headline that read, "The Tyrant Who Refuses to Die." But Lincoln did not flinch. In the winter of 1874, he gave what would become his last public address. At an abolitionist gathering in Philadelphia, under heavy guard and amid threats of violence, he stood before a crowd of aging veterans, former slaves, and young students. His voice, weakened by age, still carried, "A nation is not defined by how it treats its powerful, but by how it uplifts its powerless. We fought to create not simply a union, but a republic worthy of that name. If we abandon that now, if we retreat into comfort and compromise, we shall have done worse than secede. We shall have surrendered. The speech was met with thunderous applause and deafening opposition. That same month, a young politician from New York, Samuel J. Tilden, gave a rebuttal address that electrified the Copperhead base. Tilden, a masterful speaker and legal mind, argued that Reconstruction was no longer necessary, that the Union must be returned to its people, and that federal overreach was a greater threat than Confederate rebellion ever was. His words were measured. His intent was not. Tilden would become the new face of the movement, eclipsing even Vallandigham in popularity. And behind him rose a coalition of old Southern elites, Northern bankers, and Midwestern populists, all united not by race, region, or ideology, but by a common cause, to end the Second American Revolution. By 1875, the country stood at a precipice once more. The South smoldered. The North trembled. Lincoln, aged and increasingly isolated, continued to write, but even he could see the writing on the wall. In one of his final letters, addressed to Charles Sumner, he confessed, "I fear the world we tried to build may not last, but if we laid even a single stone upon which the next generation may stand, then perhaps it was not in vain." Yet even that stone was under threat, because the battle for Lincoln's America was no longer fought with muskets or bayonets. It was being fought with memory, and the victors would be those who controlled the story. And just as the nation prepared to celebrate its centennial, that story would be rewritten in ways even Lincoln could never have foreseen. The year was 1876. The United States of America was 100 years old. From Boston to San Francisco, from New Orleans to Chicago, parades marched beneath banners proclaiming a century of freedom. Cannons fired in salute, bands played patriotic hymns, and children memorized the names of founding fathers recited like sacred scripture. Cities illuminated their skies with fireworks, as if to say the trials of the past were finally behind them. But it was an illusion, a centennial dream forged in glass and smoke. Beneath the glittering surface of national pride, the Republic was unraveling. President Grant, now nearing the end of his second term, had become a weary figure, bruised by political scandal, drained by endless Reconstruction battles, and watching helplessly as the tide of public sentiment turned away from the ideals he and Lincoln had championed. His administration, though earnest, had become a lightning rod for populist resentment and elitist cynicism alike, and into that void stepped Samuel J. Tilden. The governor of New York, Tilden was everything his movement needed him to be: intelligent, calculated, and above all, moderate. He did not speak in the crude venom of the old Copperheads. He spoke instead of reform, of reconciliation, of healing a divided nation. But behind his polite diction lay the cold steel of counter-revolution. Tilden knew how to play the public mood. He spoke to the businessmen in Philadelphia, promising economic stability. He met with Southern leaders in Savannah, quietly assuring them federal troops would be withdrawn. He rallied Northern workers disillusioned with rising black labor competition. His message was not rage, it was fatigue, and it worked. Meanwhile, the Republican Party was fracturing. With Grant refusing a third term and the radical wing weakened by political losses, the convention in Cincinnati was a bitter affair. After 5 rounds of voting, they nominated Rutherford B. Hayes, a war hero and Ohio governor, but a man with none of Lincoln's fire or Grant's gravitas. Lincoln, now 67 years old, watched from Springfield as the centennial year unfolded. His beard had grown silver. His shoulder still ached from the bullet Booth fired 11 years before. Yet his mind remained sharp. In private letters, he warned of a coming compromise that will cost us everything we fought for. He was not wrong. The election of 1876 would become the most disputed in American history, and perhaps the most consequential. On November 7th, the votes were cast. Tilden won the popular vote decisively, but 3 Southern states, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana, reported widespread fraud and intimidation. Black voters had been turned away from polling places by gunpoint. Ballot boxes were stolen, set ablaze, or lost. In many districts, Republican turnout was suspiciously low, or erased altogether. Republican operatives claimed electoral fraud. Democrats claimed Republican tampering. The dispute came down to 20 electoral votes. If Tilden received them, he would be the next president. If Hayes did, the Republicans would hold the White House. As winter descended on Washington, the nation teetered on the brink. Southern militias mobilized quietly. Freedmen's communities braced for violence. Northern cities experienced riots, fueled by partisan fury and economic despair. Grant, still in power, deployed troops to keep peace. But their presence only deepened the perception of authoritarianism. And so, behind closed doors, a deal was struck. It would become known in our history as the Compromise of 1877. But in this timeline, shaped by Lincoln's living presence and the intensity of Reconstruction, the stakes were even higher. Tilden's representatives met with Republican leaders in a Georgetown townhouse. The proposal was clear: allow Tilden to take the presidency, and in return, he would pledge not to reverse the constitutional amendments or persecute Republican office holders. He would, however, agree to a full military withdrawal from the South, dissolve the Freedmen's Bureau, and return domestic affairs to their rightful state authorities. In short, federal abandonment of Black Americans in exchange for national peace. When Lincoln received word of the negotiations, he was devastated. He sent an open letter to the New York Tribune, warning the public, "To trade liberty for calm is to ransom our soul for silence. There is no compromise where human dignity is on the scales." But it was too late. Fearing another civil war, fearing economic collapse, and weary from years of struggle, the Republican leadership yielded. Tilden was inaugurated in March 1877. Federal troops began withdrawing that very month. Southern Democrats, long kept at bay by the barrel of a Union rifle, swept into state legislatures and governors' mansions within weeks. Jim Crow's shadow began to stretch, not as a sudden storm, but a creeping dusk. Freedmen's schools closed. Black lawmakers were driven from office, sometimes by force, sometimes by law. In Mississippi, land redistribution policies were overturned. In Alabama, voting rights laws were rewritten to require literacy tests and property ownership. The dream of racial equality was not extinguished, but it was driven underground. In Springfield, Lincoln remained outwardly composed, but his health deteriorated quickly. In July of 1877, he was found unconscious in his study, collapsed beside a half-written essay titled The Second Battle of Liberty. The country was consumed by a new crisis, a massive nationwide railroad strike that paralyzed commerce and led to violent clashes between workers and state militias. The Gilded Age had begun in earnest, and with it came a new kind of war, not between states, but between classes. Lincoln would live to see it, but only barely. Confined to a wheelchair, his lungs weakened by pneumonia, and his heart broken by the compromise he had long feared, Lincoln became a quiet observer of a nation turning away from its brief, brilliant attempt to remake itself. Frederick Douglass visited him in October of that year. In a letter recounting the meeting, Douglass wrote, "The old man sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. Then he said, 'I buried the Union once. I fear now I must bury the Republic.'" By Christmas, Lincoln was bedridden. On the morning of January 3, 1878, he passed away in his Springfield home, surrounded by his sons Robert and Tad, and by Douglass, who had refused to leave his side. He was not assassinated, but in many ways, the ideals he carried were. His funeral drew thousands: veterans, freedmen, schoolchildren, and aged abolitionists. The flag draped over his casket had once flown over Gettysburg. His coffin was carved from oak harvested in Tennessee, from a former plantation now owned by a black farmer, a quiet tribute to the world he had tried to build. But even as mourners filed past, something had shifted. The country that once feared Lincoln's death now seemed unsure what to do with his memory. Tilden did not attend the funeral. Newspapers offered polite but muted eulogies, and in the South, celebrations were held in secret, behind locked church doors and in plantation parlors. The Union had survived the war, but it was no longer Lincoln's Union. The centennial had passed, a new century loomed, and the Republic stood at a crossroads, one path leading toward the gilded promise of wealth and industry, the other toward the flickering, unfinished dream of justice. But the real question, the one history would wrestle with for decades, was this: without Lincoln, could anyone still hear the trumpet call of the better angels of our nature? Because those angels were fading fast, and the men replacing them had no wings at all. The nation that awoke in the aftermath of Abraham Lincoln's death was not one he would have recognized or accepted. It was 1878, and the illusion of unity crafted during the centennial had cracked wide open. What replaced it was not war, but a slow, methodical retreat from conscience. The North, exhausted and now consumed by economic self-interest, no longer had the will to intervene. The South, newly unshackled from federal occupation, moved quickly to re-establish control, not by reviving slavery, but by perfecting a system that replicated it. Jim Crow was born in committee meetings and courtrooms, not battlefields. In Mississippi, white lawmakers drafted the Voting Clarification Acts, stripping the franchise from any citizen unable to pass a literacy exam, exams graded by white clerks with no oversight. In Georgia, former Unionist counties were redistricted to dilute black majorities. Tennessee reinstated chain gangs under the guise of prison labor, while Alabama expanded its convict leasing program, effectively re-enslaving thousands under color of law. The Freedmen's Bureau, once a pillar of Lincoln's Reconstruction, was dismantled with almost surgical precision. Its last offices were shuttered by 1880. Its agents, once federal champions of education and civil rights, were defamed, fired, or forgotten. In their place rose local education boards that closed black schools and erased Lincoln's name from Southern textbooks. Even statues of the man who had saved the Union began to disappear from public spaces across the South. But it wasn't only the South that was changing. In the North, the end of Reconstruction triggered a different kind of transformation, one driven not by race, but by class. The Gilded Age had arrived. Railroads expanded like veins of steel across the continent. Cities swelled with smokestacks and immigrant labor. Titans of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, emerged not merely as businessmen, but as the new nobility of the American order. They built palaces in New York and fortresses in Chicago, while wages stagnated and children toiled in coal mines. Labor unions began to rise in response. Strikes erupted in Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and Detroit, but they were met with hired mercenaries, state militias, and, increasingly, the federal government itself. President Tilden, who had promised order and reconciliation, interpreted labor unrest as sedition. He wasn't alone. The new ruling class, industrialists, financiers, and political operatives, feared the working masses more than they had ever feared the Confederacy. And so, slowly, the tools of Lincoln's wartime centralization, military power, federal surveillance, emergency authority, were repurposed not to defend liberty, but to protect capital. It was an inversion of the Civil War's legacy. The very instruments used to liberate millions now served to suppress millions more. By 1882, black leaders across the South had been almost entirely removed from state legislatures. Only in isolated pockets, like Wilmington, North Carolina, or Jacksonville, Florida, did black voters still manage to maintain fragile coalitions, but they were under constant threat. Lynching became not just a method of terror, but a ritual, photographed, published, and used as a warning. Frederick Douglass, now aged and increasingly disillusioned, published a searing essay titled "The Republic Betrayed. We Buried Abraham Lincoln, and with him we buried the will to finish the work. We march not forward but backward, into shadows painted with the illusion of progress." His words stirred the conscience of a few, but the majority had already made peace with retreat. In Congress, the debate shifted. Civil rights bills were quietly shelved. The Civil Service Reform Act passed, not to protect the integrity of Reconstruction, but to insulate federal positions from populist influence. Tariffs, railroad subsidies, and banking policies dominated the legislative calendar. Race was no longer discussed in moral terms, but in legal technicalities and economic consequences. The memory of Reconstruction became a political liability. Young Republicans running for office in the 1880s distanced themselves from the old war men. Lincoln's name, once the rallying cry of justice, was now cautiously avoided in speeches. Southern Democrats rebranded themselves as reform conservatives, promising stability and tradition. Newspapers lionized men like Jefferson Davis as gentlemen of principle, while mocking Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner as dangerous radicals. In Richmond, Virginia, a bronze statue of Robert E. Lee was erected with full state honors. The sculptor, once a Unionist, dead, us. It is not history we honor, but healing. But healing for whom? In the West, as the nation expanded into territories once claimed by Mexico and native tribes, the machinery of conquest resumed its relentless advance. Native American nations, who had quietly observed the Civil War and Reconstruction with cautious hope, now found themselves cornered by railroads, reservation policies, and military force. The promises of a just republic did not reach the plains. In South Dakota, the Lakota Nation lost half its territory through new federal treaties drafted under the Tilden administration. In California, Chinese immigrants were targeted by exclusion laws and mob violence. The ideals Lincoln had once infused into policy, universal dignity, the rule of law, and the moral arc of governance, had been stripped to slogans and sold to the highest bidder. And yet, small fires of resistance still burned. In New Orleans, a secret society of freedmen and Black Civil War veterans called the Liberty Corps organized mutual aid networks, secretly funded schools, and published underground newspapers. In Kansas, Black homesteaders, former slaves turned pioneers, established all-Black towns like Nicodemus, where Lincoln's portrait still hung in public buildings. They were small but defiant. In one issue of the Liberty Banner, an editor wrote, "They can take the laws, they can take the schools, but they cannot take the memory. Lincoln lived, and while we remember, the Republic is not truly dead." But memory, too, was under siege. A new wave of lost cause literature swept the South and then infected the North. These novels and editorials reimagined the Civil War not as a battle for freedom, but as a tragic misunderstanding between gentlemen. In these stories, Lincoln was reimagined not as the great emancipator, but as a naive meddler who prolonged a war better avoided. And in schools, new textbooks began to reflect this revision. By the mid-1880s, some Southern children were being taught that slavery had benefits, that Reconstruction was a time of Black misrule, and that Abraham Lincoln had nearly destroyed the Constitution. The Civil War had ended, but the battle for its meaning had just begun. And that battle would not be won in the streets or the courts, but in the minds of a new generation. Because in every library, classroom, and public square, a war of memory was being waged, and those who controlled the memory would control the future. But a spark was coming, a moment that would reignite the legacy Lincoln had left smoldering in Springfield. Because from the ashes of Reconstruction, a voice was rising, and that voice would refuse to be forgotten. In the year 1890, a young schoolteacher stood before her students in Wilmington, North Carolina. Her name was Clara Devane, the daughter of a freedman and a Union nurse. Behind her desk hung a faded portrait of Abraham Lincoln, edges curled, colors faded, but the eyes, dark and knowing, still piercing. She pointed to it before dismissing the class. "This man gave us a future," she said, "but it is ours to defend." And so it was. Across the South, amid the rising crescendo of Jim Crow laws and Confederate mythology, small enclaves of resistance like Clara's classroom endured. They taught not just arithmetic or grammar, but memory. the kind that survived in whispered stories, hand-me-down books, and portraits hung in churches like sacred relics. But memory alone could not stop what was coming. In the 2 decades since Lincoln's death, America had become a land of paradox. Its cities swelled with immigrants and industry. Its economy roared with newfound power, and yet its soul had withered. The promises of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained ink on parchment for millions of Black Americans who now lived under a legal architecture of exclusion. Voter suppression was complete in Mississippi by 1890, and within 5 years, it spread to every corner of the South. Poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, each law surgically designed to disenfranchise without invoking the word race. The federal government, controlled by pro-business Republicans and reconciled Southern Democrats, offered only silence. Grant was long gone. Tilden had died in comfort, and the Lincoln Republicans, Sumner, Wade, Stevens, were all buried beneath stones far less visited than those of Lee and Davis. In their place rose a new political order, the Iron Consensus. Neither fully North nor South, it was a coalition of industrialists, racial moderates, and bureaucrats who prized profit over principle. To them, Lincoln was either a sainted relic, safely embalmed in marble, or a nuisance best forgotten. But history has a way of resurfacing. In 1892, as a wave of labor unrest swept the country, an extraordinary voice entered the national stage. Ida B. Wells. She was a journalist, a crusader, and, perhaps most importantly, a child of Lincoln's America. Born in Mississippi in 1862, she had come of age during the brief window when Reconstruction had held promise. She had learned to read in a freedmen's bureau school. Her parents had voted in federal elections. She had lived the dream, before it was dismantled piece by piece. Now she carried that memory like a torch. When 3 of her friends were lynched in Memphis for operating a successful Black-owned grocery store, Ida didn't mourn quietly. She wrote ferociously. Her pamphlet, Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all its phases, spread like wildfire. She published photographs, interviewed survivors, and challenged every claim of white innocence or justice. And, in one bold move, she recentered Lincoln in the conversation. In her editorials, she drew a straight line from the Emancipation Proclamation to the broken promises of 1877. She invoked Lincoln not as a saint, but as a standard, one that the current generation had betrayed. "He gave us freedom," she wrote, "and you let them take it back while you built railroads and sold steel." White newspapers condemned her. Death threats poured in. Her printing press was destroyed. But Ida kept going. She fled Memphis and traveled north, speaking in Boston, Chicago, even Washington, where she met with the remnants of the old Republican establishment and demanded federal action. But action would not come. Not yet. In fact, the backlash intensified. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal was constitutional. It was the death knell of Reconstruction's last surviving legal protections. The 14th Amendment, Lincoln's proudest legacy after the war, was reduced to a footnote, twisted by legal sophistry and racial logic. The ruling sent a chill across Black communities. It meant segregation wasn't just practice, it was law, sanctioned, sealed, and sanctified. Ida B. Wells responded with rage. She launched a new paper in Chicago, The Emancipator, borrowing the name from Lincoln's old moniker. She called it a paper for the unfinished war. In its pages, she printed every lynching she could verify, every law passed to oppress, and every Black business or school defying the system. And in one issue, published on the eve of Lincoln's birthday in 1897, she wrote a letter to him. An imagined letter, a conversation across time. "You gave us the tools, Mr. Lincoln. They took them from our hands, but we still have your words. We still have your ghost, and we are not done." The piece stirred a new generation. Young Black activists, born after Reconstruction, began to read Lincoln anew. Not the sanitized version, but the man who survived a bullet and refused to compromise. They organized debate clubs in his name. They published anthologies of his letters and speeches. Lincoln, long relegated to memorials and coins, became a living idea once again, dangerous, disruptive, and unfinished. At the same time, across the ocean, another American voice was emerging with unexpected resonance. W.E.B. Du Bois. Studying in Europe, Du Bois was struck by the stark difference in how American racial issues were perceived abroad. In Germany and England, Lincoln was still viewed as the great liberator. Yet at home, his dream lay in ruins. Du Bois wrote scathingly of the post-Lincoln betrayal, arguing that America's failure to follow through on Reconstruction had not only harmed black citizens, it had warped the soul of the entire republic. In 1899, he returned to the U.S. with a mission, and that mission began in earnest with the publication of his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk, in 1903. It was less a book than a reckoning. Du Bois blended history, sociology, and spiritual lamentation. He introduced the concept of double consciousness, but he also did something bolder. He reclaimed Lincoln as a symbol of revolutionary potential, not of peace, but of conflict yet to be resolved. In the final chapter, Du Bois wrote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and that line was drawn in the shadows of the war that ended, and the peace that never truly began." By the turn of the century, America stood at another crossroads. The Spanish-American War had just been fought. The U.S. had seized overseas colonies. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam. A new kind of empire was emerging, but its foundations were cracked. The contradiction was plain. The nation that proclaimed liberty had denied it at home. It was into this contradiction that a new coalition quietly formed: scholars, ministers, veterans' descendants, and journalists. They called themselves the Sons of the Second Republic. Their mission: to complete Lincoln's vision, to resurrect Reconstruction, and to reframe the Civil War not as a settled chapter, but an open book. They met in secret at first, in churches, union halls, back rooms of black colleges. But they were growing, and they had a date in mind. The 50th anniversary of Lincoln's death, 1928, was approaching, and they planned to make the nation remember. Because while monuments could be hidden and textbooks rewritten, the truth had not died. It had only gone underground, waiting, and now it was preparing to rise. It was the spring of 1928, and for the first time in decades, the name Abraham Lincoln was once again spoken with purpose, not as hollow praise carved into stone, but as a rallying cry. Across the country, a strange hum of anticipation pulsed through black churches, union halls, immigrant tenements, and progressive campuses. Something was coming. Not an election, not a war, but a reckoning. A moment, carefully prepared by those who had kept Lincoln's memory alive, like a coal in the ash, waiting for the right gust of history to reignite the flame. That gust arrived on April 15, 1928, the 50th anniversary of Lincoln's death. In Washington, the city braced for what officials expected to be a small, somber ceremony at Lincoln's tomb. What they got instead was a thunderclap. Tens of thousands gathered in Springfield, Illinois. They came from Alabama, from Harlem, from Pittsburgh, from Kansas and California. Black veterans from the Great War, sons of immigrants from Eastern Europe, Native American elders carrying tribal flags, white teachers who had smuggled truth into classrooms where the lost cause reigned, all stood shoulder to shoulder beneath a stormy sky. They called it the March of Memory. It was led by Ida B. Wells, now in her 60s, walking with a cane, and W.E.B. Du Bois, tall and severe in a gray suit. Behind them marched a coalition of voices long suppressed. Members of the Liberty Corps from New Orleans, descendants of Kansas homesteaders, and a growing number of white allies, including Quakers, union leaders, and professors who had read Lincoln's letters and wept. As the crowd approached the tomb, silence fell. Du Bois stepped forward and read aloud from Lincoln's final public letter, a passage forgotten by many, but carried like scripture by the marchers. The republic we labor to sustain must not be a tool for the mighty alone. It must be a shelter for the weak, a shield for the scorned, and a ladder for the shackled. If we fail in this, Algaces, the union we preserved shall rot from within. The words echoed like cannon fire. The event shocked the press. Newspapers had expected a minor gathering. Instead, they witnessed the birth of a new movement, one that refused to let Reconstruction remain a historical footnote. The New York Times called it a troubling reawakening of old divisions. The Chicago Defender declared it the beginning of the true Second Republic. That summer, chapters of the Sons and Daughters of the Second Republic opened in 30 cities. Their platform was radical by 1920s standards, yet deeply rooted in the unfinished business of the 1860s. A national anti-lynching law, full voting rights enforcement, restoration of Reconstruction-era protections, federal accountability for local civil rights violations, and the creation of a national holiday for Abraham Lincoln, not just a day off, but a day of civic reckoning. Their slogans were short, sharp, and deliberately unsettling to the ruling class. Lincoln lived, you erased him. We're not asking, we're resuming. The war was never over. President Calvin Coolidge ignored them. So did Congress. But in the streets, on college campuses, in black newspapers, and labor bulletins, the movement exploded. Even in the segregated South, whispers of the Second Republic spread. Some were curious, others terrified. And then, as if history demanded it, a bolt struck the center of the nation. In the fall of 1929, the stock market collapsed. What followed was more than financial ruin. It was a collapse of faith. Factories shuttered, breadlines grew. The same industrial barons, who had crushed labor and funded lost cause propaganda, watched their fortunes evaporate. And suddenly, the moral questions Lincoln had posed decades earlier, about justice, equality, and the soul of the republic, no longer felt academic. They felt essential. In 1930, under the weight of economic despair, the Second Republic movement formed its own political wing, the Lincoln Labor Party. Their candidate, A. Philip Randolph, a labor organizer, pacifist, and firebrand orator. His platform fused the legacy of Lincoln's wartime justice with 20th-century socialism, workers' rights, racial justice, and a federal guarantee of equal opportunity. He didn't win, but he cracked the walls. In city after city, Randolph's message found ears. He won 11% of the popular vote, unprecedented for a third-party candidate, and enough to terrify both Democrats and Republicans. He took majorities in several black-heavy districts in Chicago, Detroit, and Harlem, even carrying 2 counties in Kansas that had been founded by freedmen in the 1870s. The response was swift. Conservative politicians launched a new wave of voter suppression bills, red-baiting campaigns, and propaganda denouncing the Second Republic as a threat to American values. But the genie was out. Randolph had reawakened a question that had been buried for 50 years. What if Reconstruction had never ended? In 1931, Du Bois published a follow-up to The Souls of Black Folk, this time titled The Wars We Never Fought. In it, he examined how the failure of Lincoln's successors had allowed the Old South to resurrect itself, and how Northern indifference had ossified systemic injustice into national policy. But the most powerful chapter was the final one, The Ghost at the Capitol. In it, Du Bois imagined Lincoln walking through modern Washington, watching black men scrub the marble floors of courthouses they couldn't enter as jurors, watching children segregated by law, watching politicians invoke his name while undoing his work. The ghost does not weep, he wrote. It watches, and one day it will return, not as a man, but as an idea. And that idea will not ask permission. That return was closer than anyone knew, because the Great Depression was not just a financial crisis. It was a crucible. As Franklin D. Roosevelt began building his New Deal, activists from the Second Republic demanded inclusion in labor programs, in federal housing, in education. And when the government tried to sideline them, they organized. In 1933, black workers marched on Washington, not in thousands, but in tens of thousands. Their chant was simple: "This country was built by our blood. It shall not be rebuilt without us." The Lincoln labor leagues expanded rapidly in the early 30s, now including white tenant farmers, Latino railroad workers, and Jewish immigrants fleeing European fascism. They didn't always agree, but they had one unifying creed: Lincoln's vision was not finished. It was stolen, and it would be reclaimed. They framed the Civil War not as a past victory, but a present mandate. And slowly, reluctantly, Roosevelt listened. By 1935, elements of the New Deal began incorporating racial justice. The WPA opened more programs to black workers. Eleanor Roosevelt invited leaders of the Second Republic to the White House. Anti-lynching bills gained traction, and the Lincoln Labor Party began to exert real influence, not just in elections, but in shaping the national conversation. It was not enough, but it was movement. And in 1939, on the eve of another global war, W.E.B. Du Bois stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial and delivered a speech to 100,000 people. "The Second Republic is not a fantasy. It is the inheritance denied to our fathers, the mission our mothers carried in silence, the cause our children must complete, and we will not rest until the last bond of that unfinished war is broken." It was the speech that would define a generation, because the battle for Lincoln's legacy, once waged in backrooms and printing presses, was now marching back into the heart of American power. And this time, it wouldn't stop at memory. It was coming for the law, the schools, the vote, and eventually, the Constitution itself. The 1940s dawned with smoke on the horizon, not just from American factories roaring into wartime production, but from the burning cities of Europe. Hitler had marched into Poland. Japan had seized Manchuria. Fascism was rising, and democracy, that fragile, flickering candle Lincoln had once fought to preserve, now faced annihilation across the globe. The United States, though not yet at war, stood at a crossroads. And within its borders, the struggle for Lincoln's Second Republic surged forward with new urgency. The New Deal had done much to stabilize the nation's economy, but its soul remained fractured. While President Franklin D. Roosevelt expanded programs and jobs, systemic racism endured. Black workers were routinely denied entry to union jobs. Public housing remained segregated. The military, despite desperate need, maintained a strict whites-only policy in many command roles. For the leaders of the Second Republic movement, this was not acceptable. They knew that if America was to claim the mantle of freedom abroad, it must first honor it at home. And so, in 1941, months before Pearl Harbor, A. Philip Randolph, now a national figure, issued a threat: a march on Washington. Not a symbolic gathering, not a weekend demonstration. A mass protest of over 100,000 black citizens descending on the Capitol, demanding defense jobs, military integration, and an executive order to enforce equality. Roosevelt panicked. He had managed to keep the nation from civil unrest during the Great Depression. But this was different. This was Lincoln's ghost, now fully awake, marching on the doorstep of American power. And so, under pressure, Roosevelt relented. He signed Executive Order 8802, prohibiting racial discrimination in the defense industry and establishing the Fair Employment Practices Committee, FEPC. It was a half measure, toothless in enforcement, but it was a crack in the dam. The march was postponed, but the pressure did not subside. As World War II erupted, the Second Republic took on new dimensions. Black soldiers, many of whom came from towns where Lincoln's portrait still hung above pulpits, enlisted in droves. They served in segregated units, often given the most dangerous or thankless jobs, but they carried more than rifles. They carried expectation that when they returned, they would no longer be second-class citizens. W.E.B. Du Bois called it the Double V campaign: victory against fascism abroad, and victory against racism at home. It caught fire. Newspapers from Pittsburgh to Los Angeles printed stories of black heroes in uniform: Tuskegee Airmen, battlefield medics, logistics engineers, but they also printed stories of the humiliations they endured, being denied service at lunch counters, barred from officers' clubs, beaten for wearing the uniform too proudly in the South. And it was in this crucible that a bold, radical idea reemerged. Reconstruction must be completed. Through constitutional transformation, the Lincoln Labor Leagues, the sons and daughters of the Second Republic, and a growing cadre of allied progressives in Congress, including voices from the labor left and immigrant rights groups, drafted what they called the Second Reconstruction Amendments. They were sweeping, ambitious, and deeply controversial. There were 5 proposed amendments. 1. The Right to Vote Amendment, eliminating all literacy tests, poll taxes, and discriminatory registration practices nationwide. 2. The Equal Protection Enforcement Clause, granting Congress and the courts explicit power to enforce the 14th Amendment's promises in all jurisdictions, overriding states that refused compliance. 3. The Economic Citizenship Amendment, guaranteeing a baseline of economic rights, fair wages, protection from exploitative labor, access to housing and education. 4. The Anti-Lynching and Civil Rights Protection Amendment, federalizing lynching as a capital crime and empowering civil rights commissions to investigate and prosecute hate crimes. 5. The Lincoln Legacy Amendment, establishing a national holiday on April 15th in honor of Lincoln's death, not as a day of celebration, but of recommitment to liberty and equality. The proposals divided the country. Southern segregationists exploded in fury. Conservative Northerners warned of creeping socialism. Editorials screamed of a radical takeover, and whispers of subversive elements began circulating through J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. But the movement had numbers and momentum. Returning Black veterans flooded the Lincoln Leagues with new energy. Teachers, journalists, and unionists began holding teach-ins and rallies, and a new generation of politicians, Assassinated, raised on stories of Lincoln not as a distant figure, but as a mission, began entering state legislatures and city councils. Among them was a young congressman from Georgia, Martin Luther King Sr., known for his thunderous oratory and devout Christian faith. King Sr. invoked Lincoln in every speech. "He did not die for statues," he told a roaring crowd in Atlanta. "He lived for justice, and if we abandon that, we have buried more than a man. We have buried a covenant." In 1947, the first of the proposed amendments, the right to vote, reached Congress. It passed the House by a slim margin. The Senate threatened a filibuster. The nation teetered again, just as it had in 1866, in 1876, and in every year since. And then, Harry Truman made his move. A moderate Missouri Democrat, Truman had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the moral contradictions of the post-war world. He had desegregated the armed forces by executive order in 1948, against the advice of his party elders, and now, in the twilight of his presidency, he saw the Second Republic not as a threat, but as a rescue. In his final State of the Union address in January 1953, Truman shocked the nation. "The unfinished work of Abraham Lincoln lies before us still. We defeated fascism abroad. Now let us defeat injustice at home. These amendments are not radical. They are overdue." The speech split the Democratic Party in two. Southern Dixiecrats walked out. Newspapers declared the death of the old order. But the Republican Party, fractured since the days of Roosevelt, was also divided. Moderate Republicans, inspired by Lincoln's memory and the growing influence of Black voters in northern cities, formed a new bloc, the Lincoln Republicans. It was enough. In 1954, the Right to Vote Amendment was ratified by 38 states, just barely crossing the threshold. That same year, Brown vs. Board of Education reached the Supreme Court, and for the first time in history, the court cited the new amendment as a legal foundation for its decision. Segregation, declared unconstitutional, was no longer just a moral failure. It was now a constitutional violation. The momentum continued. By 1956, two more of the proposed amendments were passed. equal protection enforcement and anti-lynching. Though the economic amendment stalled and the holiday remained controversial, the direction was clear. The Second Reconstruction had begun, not with bayonets or battalions, but with ballots, books, and bold ideas. And in cities across America, something miraculous happened. The dusty, defaced portraits of Abraham Lincoln were taken down from attic corners and rehung in classrooms, churches, and union halls. But now, they sat beside new portraits of Wells, Du Bois, Randolph, and King Sr. Lincoln's memory had not been canonized. It had been expanded. The republic he had envisioned was no longer just a dream carried by war-weary men in frock coats. It was becoming real, and in the pulsing heart of this new chapter, one question remained. Could a nation finally become what it claimed to be? Because on the horizon stood a new figure, a child born into the legacy of both Lincoln and Reconstruction, and he would take the next step on the road Lincoln began. The year was 1963, and the air in Washington, D.C. was thick with humidity and history. 250,000 people had gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, facing the towering stone figure of the man whose death had once signaled the uncertain rebirth of a nation. But this day was not a memorial. It was a movement. Children of the Second Republic had come of age. They were sharecroppers from Mississippi, steelworkers from Detroit, students from Howard and Morehouse, rabbis from New York, war veterans from Korea, and civil rights workers from Alabama, all brought together under one banner: Equality Now. And they came to listen to the voice that had emerged from that long and broken lineage, the son of a preacher born into the very soil Reconstruction had failed to cleanse. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. His name echoed across the nation, not just because of his oratory, but because he was a direct link between the old dream and the unfinished struggle. His father had marched with the Lincoln Leagues, his sermons were laced with Lincoln's cadence, and he understood, perhaps more deeply than anyone, that they were not simply asking for rights. They were demanding the republic Lincoln had envisioned. And on that day, August 28, 1963, before a hushed crowd standing beneath Lincoln's gaze, King delivered the speech that would transcend time. "I have a dream," he said. And as the words soared, so too did the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. No longer a statue, no longer a myth, but a living promise waiting to be fulfilled. But even as King spoke of harmony and hope, the machinery of resistance ground on. Southern segregationists, many of them direct ideological heirs of the post-1877 rollback, met in secret to devise new tactics: gerrymandering, private school charters, and coded language of state rights. In the North, redlining, housing discrimination, and employment bias quietly ensured that structural racism did not end. It evolved. And in Washington, the fight resumed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. A monumental achievement, yes, but one bought at a heavy price. The Southern Bloc fractured. The Democratic Party split. And in the shadows, a new conservative movement began rising, one that cloaked its ideology in the language of freedom, but carried with it the same suspicion of federal power, civil rights enforcement, and racial equality that had killed Reconstruction once before. But this time, history had momentum on its side. The Voting Rights Act followed in 1965, sweeping away decades of legal voter suppression. The Second Republic activists celebrated, from the churches of Selma to the union halls of Cleveland. It felt like vindication, like destiny, like Lincoln's covenant was finally being honored. And then came the shattering. In April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. The bullet that struck him did more than take a life. It echoed down through time, a grim mirror of the bullet Booth had failed to deliver over a century earlier. But unlike 1865, the aftermath was different. This time, the movement did not collapse. Cities burned, mourners wept. But within weeks, the Fair Housing Act was passed. Within months, national conversations began on reparations, affirmative action, and systemic reform. The generation that had inherited the dream refused to let it die again. In Chicago, Jesse Jackson launched Operation Push. In Oakland, the Black Panther Party provided free meals and health clinics to children Lincoln's Republic had failed. In classrooms, students read not just the Gettysburg Address, but Du Bois, Wells, and Baldwin. But with progress came a new strategy of opposition: denial. By the late 1970s and early 80s, a different narrative began to rise, one that claimed the work was finished, that racism had been solved, that Lincoln's dream had been completed, and any further demand for equality was a form of division. It was a lie, but it was an effective one. The Reagan era ushered in a rollback of federal civil rights enforcement. Wealth inequality soared. Urban Black communities were ravaged by disinvestment, over-policing, and the war on drugs. Prisons filled with young men who bore the genetic memory of slavery and segregation. Meanwhile, textbooks quietly softened the story of Reconstruction, portraying it as a misguided experiment rather than a righteous crusade. Once again, the Republic stood at risk, not from rebellion, but from forgetting. And yet, again, the movement endured. In 1992, after the Rodney King verdict and the ensuing LA uprising, a new generation of activists rose, connecting police brutality to a long lineage of systemic failure. They did not invoke Lincoln with marble reverence. They invoked him with rage. "Lincoln bled to stop this," one protest sign read, "and you call it order." Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, civil rights groups adapted to new arenas, fighting for environmental justice in poisoned neighborhoods, against voter ID laws, and for educational equity in segregated school districts cloaked in post-racial language. Then, in 2008, something happened that would have seemed impossible in 1877, unthinkable in 1968, and barely conceivable even a decade prior. A Black man, Barack Hussein Obama, was elected President of the United States. He stood on the same Capitol steps where Lincoln had once looked across a nation torn in two. His hand rested on Lincoln's Bible, and as he took the oath of office, millions watched with tears in their eyes, believing, even if just for a moment, that the circle had closed. But history is not a circle, it is a spiral, and progress is never permanent. In the years that followed, backlash surged. Racialized rhetoric, gerrymandering, voter suppression, the old strategies returned, dressed in the language of fiscal conservatism and national security. By 2020, America erupted once more, not from war, but from suffocation. George Floyd's murder triggered global protests, and suddenly Lincoln's name resurfaced again. Invoked by activists, debated by pundits, and painted on murals beside King, Du Bois, and Wells. The question was no longer whether Lincoln's Republic had been fulfilled. The question was whether it had ever been truly attempted. In Portland, in Minneapolis, in Washington, D.C., young protesters knelt in silence beneath the unblinking eyes of Lincoln's statue, the same statue that had watched King deliver his dream decades before. Some accused them of sacrilege. Others saw it as holy. In 2021, Congress passed the Lincoln Restoration Act, a sweeping federal civil rights package modeled on the Second Reconstruction Amendments drafted nearly a century earlier. It included automatic voter registration, restoration of the Voting Rights Act, federal oversight of police departments, and the creation of a Truth and Memory Commission to document racial injustice since 1877. It was controversial, it was challenged, but it passed. And on April 15, 2022, for the first time, Lincoln Day was observed as a national day of reflection, education, and recommitment, not with sales and parades, but with community forums, teach-ins, and storytelling from those who had inherited both his vision and his pain. In a high school in Montgomery, Alabama, a student stood up and asked her teacher, "Was Lincoln the one who gave us freedom?" Her teacher paused, then answered, "He lit the fire, but we carried it, and we still do." Because Lincoln was not the end of the story. He was the warning and the invitation. And now, in the dawn of a new century, the question remained, could a nation that had killed Reconstruction finally resurrect it? The final reckoning was here, and the soul of the Republic, still bloodied, still brilliant, waited for its verdict. It was April 15th, 2025, 160 years to the day since Abraham Lincoln had stood at Ford's Theater and nearly died beneath John Wilkes Booth's gun. But in this timeline, in this fragile, extraordinary version of the American experiment, Lincoln had lived. And because he had lived, the story of the United States had taken a different path. Not easier, not cleaner, but deeper, more honest. A path that had refused to let the Civil War end in marble statues and silence. A path that had carried its wounds like torches instead of shackles. On this day, in a dozen cities across the country, Americans gathered for what had now become a solemn ritual, Lincoln Day. Not a flag-waving celebration, but a national reckoning. In Chicago, activists read aloud from Lincoln's letters to Frederick Douglass and his final speeches defending Reconstruction. In Atlanta, schoolchildren recited both the Emancipation Proclamation and Ida B. Wells's writings on lynching, side by side. In Topeka, Kansas, a group of Black and Native veterans stood together to dedicate a new monument to those who fought after the war was supposed to end. At the National Archives in Washington, D.C., the original Second Reconstruction Amendments were displayed behind bulletproof glass. People filed past them slowly, as if viewing relics from a battlefield, and in many ways, they were. The Right to Vote Amendment, the Equal Protection Enforcement Clause, the Anti-Lynching and Civil Rights Protection Amendment, and the long-delayed but finally ratified Economic Citizenship Amendment, passed in 2021 after decades of debate and protest. These were no longer forgotten dreams. They were living law. But even as Americans honored this legacy, they understood that permanence was a myth. Liberty, as Lincoln once warned, must be nursed and guarded by each generation anew, and that fight was far from over. In 2025, challenges remained, deep and structural. Economic inequality still traced the color line. Police reform remained an unfinished struggle. Education disparities persisted. Environmental justice had only recently entered the national conscience, and a digital age, with its algorithms and echo chambers, threatened to fracture reality itself. But the difference now was memory. Not mythologized, not weaponized, but integrated. History had not been rewritten. It had been reclaimed. And so, the America of 2025, this version forged by Lincoln's survival, stood as a different kind of nation, one that bore its contradictions in the open, one that had failed, repeatedly, but had not surrendered to those failures. A republic not perfected, but unflinching. Still, there was one more scene, one final image to close this long journey. In Springfield, Illinois, at the home where Abraham Lincoln had written his last letters and watched the world change from his study window, a boy of 12 stood before a bronze plaque. He was the great-great-grandson of a former Union soldier, a black soldier who had once guarded a polling station in Alabama with a rifle in his hand and Lincoln's words in his pocket. The boy read the inscription silently. This house once belonged to a man who refused to let the Union die. He chose not martyrdom, but burden, not escape, but engagement, and in doing so gave us not a perfect republic, but a second chance. His mother called to him. He looked up at her, then back to the house. What would he think of us now? He asked. She looked out at the crowd, diverse, tired, alert, alive, and then down at him. I think, she said, he'd say the story isn't finished. And she was right, because history is not a monument. It is a direction, a wound that demands tending, a hope that must be made real, over and over again. Abraham Lincoln did not save the republic. He challenged it to be better than its founding, to live up to its declarations, to finish what it starts. That challenge remains, and so we end where we began, not with a bullet, but with a question. What do you think would have happened if this alternate world became reality? Would it have made our world better or worse? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and if you found this journey fascinating, don't forget to like and share the video.